Between the years 1841 and 1872, not a single birth record exists for a specific stretch of bottomland along the forked Deer River. Not one. Over 3 decades, across more than 4,000 acres of working farmland, children came into the world, and the world did not write their names down. The county clerk's ledgers skipped those years as cleanly as a blade across a page. Historians who have examined those records describe the gap not as an accident of fire or flood, but as something more deliberate, a silence that was maintained, renewed, and protected by the men who held power in that county for a generation. When a circuit judge finally rode out to that land in the autumn of 1872, what he discovered in a single afternoon of questioning changed the way 3 families were known in that region forever. What he discovered also raised a question that no court, no legislature, and no record book ever fully answered. Who decides which children are counted, and who decides which ones disappear? Before we continue with the story of the Calvert farm and the children the county refused to see, if you're new to this channel, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to know what state or city you're in tonight. This story is going to stay with you long after you've stopped listening. The river bottomland of western Tennessee in the 1840s was not a gentle place. It was a country of dark clay soil and thick summer air, of cottonwood and river cane, and of water that rose without warning and dropped crops without mercy. The men who farmed it were not soft men. They were practical, often brutal in the way that frontier economies demand brutality, not theatrical cruelty, but the quiet, sustained cruelty of systems maintained for profit and never questioned aloud. And it is in precisely that kind of silence, institutional, deliberate, unremarkable to those who benefit from it, that the most lasting horrors take root. The region that would come to be called Harlan County, though the official designation would shift twice before the Civil War settled the matter of county lines for good, sat between 2 river tributaries in the western Tennessee interior, a country that had been cultivated intensively since the 1820s. Cotton was grown there, though not in the same quantities as the deeper Delta South. What the bottomland produced more consistently was corn, hemp, and labor. Enormous, sustained quantities of organized labor, built around a plantation economy that had taken root in the Tennessee interior with remarkable speed after the forced removal of the Chickasaw Nation had cleared the land in the 1830s. The removal itself had been recent enough, in 1841, that the old Chickasaw trading paths were still the best roads through the county. The earth that the Calvert family farmed had been other people's land within living memory. The men who broke the clay and planted it belonged to a cycle of dispossession so total, so systematic, that each layer of it had been designed to render the previous layer invisible. The Chickasaw were removed so the land could be farmed, and the people who farmed it were not counted in the documents so they could be moved without consequence. The system worked, and it worked for a very long time, because the people who ran it understood one essential truth. To control a record is to control a reality. By 1841, the dominant family in that stretch of river country was the Calverts. Elias Calvert, his 2 brothers Jonah and Denton, and their respective households, each claiming sections of the bottomland that their father had begun acquiring in the early 1830s. Elias was the eldest and the most prosperous of the 3. He had arrived in the county in 1829 with 3 enslaved men, a wagon of tools, and a letter of credit from a Memphis merchant house that gave him purchasing power he did not yet have the capital to back. By 1841, he was running a working farm of nearly 2,000 acres with a labor force that contemporary tax records place at between 40 and 60 persons. though the exact number fluctuated deliberately, systematically, with sales, purchases, births, and deaths that were not always recorded in any consistent manner. Elias Calvert was a compact, deliberate man. The few physical descriptions of him that survive come from the letters of neighbors and business associates, and they are notably consistent. A man of few words, described as difficult to read, who expressed himself most comfortably through the signing of documents. He served briefly as a county commissioner in the early 1840s and was known as a reliable voice for what the community called settled order, meaning the preservation of existing property arrangements against any interference from outside authority, whether that authority came from Nashville, from northern newspapers, or from any quarter that had opinions about how the river bottomland of western Tennessee ought to be managed. He was not, by any account that survives, a violent man in any conspicuous sense. He did not appear to be a man who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. He was something perhaps more frightening in its way. A man who had reduced human beings entirely to the language of assets and liabilities. A man for whom the question of a child born on his property was primarily an accounting question. He answered in the currency of what was recorded and what was not. He kept no diary. He wrote few letters. What he left behind was financial. Ledgers, bills of sale, tax assessments, and the remarkable, sustained, deliberate absence of birth records for every child born on his land across 3 full decades. His brother Jonah managed what the family called the labor records, a set of internal books that tracked the movements, ages, assigned tasks, and dispositions of the people held in bondage on the Calvert holdings. These records were private. They were not submitted to any county authority. They were kept in a strongbox in the back room of the farm's main office, a low-ceilinged room behind the main house that smelled of river damp and ink. Those records do not survive. What happened to them, whether they were burned, buried, or simply lost in the chaos of the war years, is not known. Their destruction, if it was deliberate, was itself a kind of record-keeping in reverse. Denton, the youngest of the 3 Calvert brothers, was a less significant figure in the story. He farmed a smaller section of the property, had fewer people in bondage, and died in 1857 of a fever, leaving his land to his sons. He appears in this story primarily as evidence that the practice of non-recording was not unique to Elias. Denton's property shows the same gap in the county birth ledgers as his brother's. It was a family practice. Perhaps it was a county practice. But the Calverts were the largest holders, and the Calvert Gap is the one that stretches longest and most completely across those 31 years. To understand the country these men lived in, to understand how what they did was possible, and why no one stopped them for so long, you need to understand something about the texture of daily life in that part of Tennessee in those years. The county town was a modest settlement of perhaps 400 souls, with a courthouse, a land office, 2 churches, a hotel, a tavern, and a general store that also served as the informal clearinghouse for county gossip and county opinion. The court held sessions 4 times a year. The county clerk's office was staffed by 1 man and, intermittently, a deputy. The circuit judge came through twice annually, heard whatever cases had accumulated, and moved on. The world was not well documented, by the standards of what we now understand documentation to mean. Records were kept when they served the interests of the people with the power to keep or not keep them. And in a county where the largest landholders had both the local political influence and the daily practical authority to shape what the county clerk's office did and did not record, the absence of documentation for the people they held in bondage was not a bureaucratic failure. It was a bureaucratic choice made at multiple levels, by multiple people over many years. Among the families who lived and worked on the Calvert land in those years, there were women who had given birth alone in the dark, attended by the other women of the quarters, without a doctor, without a midwife from town, without any official acknowledgement that the child had arrived. There were men who had watched their children grow from infancy to adolescence without a single piece of paper anywhere in the county's records, noting that those children existed. There were grandmothers who could recite the ages and birthdays of their grandchildren with precision, who kept that knowledge sharp and present, because they understood, in the way that people who have been made invisible understand, that the memory of the community was the only record they had. The county would not write it down, so they remembered it instead, fiercely, carefully, across generations. By 1850, the federal census records Elias Calvert as the holder of 57 enslaved people. The census does not record their names. It records their sex and approximate age in broad strokes. Male, approximately 35. Female, approximately 22. Child, and sex female, approximately 4. Numbers in a column assigned by the enumerator, who had not gone to the quarters to count for himself. He had sat on the porch with Elias Calvert and written down what he was told. Whether the numbers were accurate, whether 57 was the true count or a convenient figure, is impossible to verify. It is simply what the record says, and the record, by design, says very little. The winter of 1848 was unusually cold by the standards of Western Tennessee, with hard frosts that lasted into March and a stretch of sleet in February that turned the dirt roads into treacherous channels of frozen mud. It was in this winter that a woman named Celia, no last name recorded anywhere, age estimated at approximately 30 years, a mother of at least 3 young children, left the Calvert property on foot and walked the 7 miles to the county town. We know she made this walk because Prewitt Holt, who was the county clerk at the time, wrote about it. Holt was a meticulous man, a keeper of personal records as precise as his professional ones. And he maintained a diary throughout his years in office that his family preserved after his death. The diary was donated to a church archive in the 1890s and survived 2 floods and 1 fire before it was identified by a researcher in the middle of the 20th century as a document of significant historical interest. In his entry for a day in February of 1848, Holt describes a visit to his office by a Negro woman from the Calvert place, who had arrived, he writes, in a state of evident distress, and her shoes unsuitable for the weather, and her manner agitated, though she spoke quietly and without causing disruption. She had asked him, he records, whether there was any official record of her children in the county's books. She had asked him whether their births had ever been recorded. He writes that he explained to her that the office had no such records, and that in any case, such records were the responsibility of the head of household to submit, and that this had not been done. He writes that he sent her away. He notes that she asked nothing further and left. He does not write down her children's names. He does not describe what she looked like beyond the condition of her shoes. He does not record what expression she wore when he told her that her children did not exist in any official document. He wrote, "She asked for a record, and I told her there was none, and she left." What he does write, and this is the passage that the researcher who discovered his diary identified as the most significant, is that within 2 days of Celia's visit, Elias Calvert had come to his office personally. Calvert had expressed, Holt writes, satisfaction with the manner in which the negress's inquiry had been handled. He had brought with him a small gift, which Holt describes only as a token of appreciation. And he had suggested, without apparently needing to be direct about it, that Holt might continue handling such inquiries in a similarly discreet manner. Holt records this without visible discomfort. He records it as a straightforward transaction, a constituent pleased with the service he had received, and expressing that pleasure in the customary way. It is possible that Holt was a cynical man who understood exactly what had happened and chose to write about it neutrally to protect himself. It is possible that he was simply a man of his time and place, so thoroughly embedded in the logic of the system he served that the transaction seemed unremarkable to him. The diary does not tell us. The diary tells us only what he observed and what he did, and that Elias Calvert was satisfied. The tax records for the Calvert property in 1849 show a reduction in the enumerated labor force of 5 persons, 4 of them by the age and sex categories used, consistent with a woman in her early 30s and 3 young children. The record gives no destination, no explanation, no notation of sale or transfer. They are simply gone from the column, present in 1848, absent in 1849, with the gap between those 2 years as blank as the space where their names would have been written if anyone had ever written them. Celia had walked 7 miles in February sleet to ask whether her children's births were recorded. She had been told no and sent away. And within 2 days, the man who controlled her life had been to the county clerk's office to express his satisfaction. Within a year, she and her children were gone from the property's enumeration. Where they went, no record says. But there was a girl on the Calvert property in the winter of 1848 who was 16 years old and who watched her mother put on her inadequate shoes and walk away down the frozen road toward the county town, who saw her mother return, who watched, or in the weeks that followed, whatever happened in the months between Celia's visit to the clerk and the moment when the 5 persons vanished from the tax ledger. That girl's name was Dorothea, and she would remember everything for the next 24 years. And she would be sitting in a courtroom in October of 1872 when it finally mattered to say it out loud. But that was far in the future. In 1848, Dorothea was 16, and her mother was gone, and the county's ledgers did not record the loss of anyone. For the county, nothing had happened. That was the point. The years between 1848 and the outbreak of the Civil War on the Calvert property were years of surface stability and buried suffering. The particular combination that characterized the antebellum plantation South at its most functional. Cotton prices fluctuated. Corn prices held. The hemp crop was inconsistent. The labor force turned over in ways that the tax records track in their impersonal arithmetic. Increases in some years, decreases in others, with the decreases almost always occurring in the years following a price spike in the slave markets of Memphis and New Orleans. Dorothea, the 16-year-old who had watched her mother walk away, grew into a woman on that land. She had been born there, by her own later account, around 1832, which would have made her among the older residents of the quarters by the time of the war. She was known, by accounts gathered after the war by the Freedmen's Bureau agent Thomas Crane, as a woman of considerable internal authority, someone whose opinion was sought within the community of the quarters, whose memory was trusted, and whose silences were as meaningful as her words. She had children of her own, 7 of them, born across roughly 2 decades, each one into a world that the county's official records would not acknowledge. She had thought carefully over all those years about what the absence of a record meant. She had had her mother's example. She had had 24 years to consider it. She understood that the silence was not passive. It was not simply the county failing to notice. It was the county actively choosing not to record because the people doing the choosing understood exactly what that omission made possible. Unrecorded children could be sold without documentation. Unrecorded people could be moved without trail. The absence of a name in a ledger was not nothing. It was an instrument. It was a tool with a specific function, Bardru, and that function was to ensure that the law could never find you, because the law had never written you down. The Civil War came to Western Tennessee in the early spring of 1862, and it came with the particular violence of a region that was both strategically important and deeply divided. The Cumberland and Tennessee rivers were corridors for Union movement into the Confederate interior, and federal forces pushed south through the county in a campaign that left the local plantation economy, already under strain from the disruptions of wartime, in a condition of acute disorder. Supply lines were cut. Crops rotted in fields that had no labor to harvest them, because the people who had done that harvesting were, in the chaos of the Union advance, making decisions about their own movements for the first time in their lives. Elias Calvert did not live to see the full collapse of the world he had built. He died in January of 1863 at the age of 61 of pneumonia. The cold, prosaic death that carries off so many men who have survived more dramatic threats. He left the property to his sons, two of whom were serving with Confederate forces in the Tennessee theater, and one of whom, the youngest, Edmund, had remained on the farm and was managing what remained of the operation under conditions that his letters describe as increasingly untenable. Edmund Calvert was 23 years old when his father died, and he was not prepared for what he had inherited. He had grown up on that farm, had understood the labor of it from the inside in the way that a child understands the furniture of his house. Present, functional, unremarkable. But he had not been educated in the administrative machinery that kept it running, because the administrative machinery had been kept deliberately obscure. His father had managed the records himself, had kept the ledgers locked, had handled the relationship with the county clerk personally. What Edmund had inherited was a property without a map of its own operation. In the middle of a war that was dismantling the legal framework on which the entire operation depended, he did what men in his position across the South were doing. He tried to hold it together. He negotiated with the Union officers who passed through the county, presenting himself as a moderate, a practical man, a farmer who simply wanted to maintain his property. He managed the labor force in the way his father had managed it, with the difference that he no longer had the legal standing to prevent people from leaving if they chose to go. Some did choose to go. Others did not, held by the same calculus that had always governed such choices. The uncertainty of what lay beyond, the weight of family ties, the practical reality that leaving on foot with children in a war zone was a different kind of danger from the one they were already managing. After emancipation, after the war's end, Edmund Calvert found himself in a new legal situation that the law called freedom, and that looked, from where the people of the former quarters stood, like something considerably more ambiguous. They were free, in the sense that the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States said they were free. They were citizens, in the sense that the 14th Amendment said they were citizens. But freedom without land, without capital, without the official documentation that would have allowed them to establish legal identities, without birth records, without any paper that said they had ever existed as people in the eyes of the county, was a freedom with very narrow practical dimensions. The sharecropping contracts that Edmund Calvert drew up in 1866 and 1867 were legal instruments of a kind. They specified crop shares, tenant obligations, the conditions of indebtedness to the farm store. They were signed, mostly with marks, by people who had been prevented from learning to read, which was itself a deliberate policy of the antebellum South, since literacy would have made the ledgers legible to them. The contracts were witnessed by Edmund Calvert and his cousin Marsh Calvert, who had returned from the Confederate forces in the spring of 1865 and had taken up residence on the property as Edmund's general assistant and enforcer of terms. The contracts preserved the essential architecture of control. The people of the former quarters would continue to farm the land, would continue to owe their primary economic allegiance to the Calvert family, and would continue to live and raise their children in a condition of practical dependency that the law now said was voluntary, and that reality said was not. And the births of those children, free children now, citizens by constitutional right, continued to go unrecorded. The county clerk's office did not send anyone to the former quarters to take down names. Now, Edmund Calvert did not submit documentation. The silence that had persisted for 25 years simply continued, wearing new clothes. Thomas Crane, the Freedmen's Bureau agent, who would eventually bring this silence to a judge's attention, had arrived in the county in 1867. He was 26 years old, from a Quaker family in eastern Ohio, and he had come south with a combination of genuine idealism and methodical habits that would prove to be an unusual combination for the work he was doing. The Bureau was understaffed, underfunded, and operating in a legal and political environment that was actively hostile. The Tennessee legislature had passed a series of measures designed to limit the Bureau's reach, and the county's white political establishment regarded Bureau agents as unwelcome intruders. So, Crane had been threatened twice in his first year, once in explicit terms by a man he identified in his reports only as a former overseer from the Calvert property, who had told him, on the road between the county town and the river, that his presence was not desired, and that the local community had ways of expressing that sentiment. He had stayed. He had made notes. It was the notes that would eventually matter. Thomas Crane had spent 5 years in western Tennessee by 1872. And in those 5 years, he had developed a methodical understanding of the county's record-keeping practices that no one else, not the county officials, not the state government in Nashville, not the federal authorities, had taken the time to acquire. He had gone through the clerk's ledgers not as a lawyer looking for precedent, but as a man trying to understand a system, trying to see the shape of it by examining what it produced and what it deliberately refused to produce. The birth records gap was not something he identified immediately. It came to him gradually, over months of examination, the way a pattern in a carpet emerges only when you step back far enough to see the whole design. He would be looking at one set of records, land transactions, say, or the enrollment records for the freed people's schools the Bureau was trying to establish. And he would find himself reaching for the birth records to verify an age or establish a family connection, and the birth records would not be there. Not for that family, not for that property, not for that year or the year before it, or the decade before that. He began keeping a separate log of what was missing. He would note the property, the year, the type of record he had expected to find and had not found. The log grew through the winter of 1871 and into the spring of 1872. And by the time he had spent 3 months going through the clerk's ledgers systematically, a process he conducted during the office's open hours, with the county clerk watching him with barely concealed irritation. He had a table that covered 31 years and 4 major properties in the county, with the Calvert holdings showing the most complete and unbroken gap. He showed the table to Augustus Reese in the summer of 1872, when he was helping Reese prepare the land dispute claim. Reese looked at it for a long time. He said, "Those aren't gaps. Those are graves. They're the shape of people who were never supposed to exist." Crane wrote that down. He wrote it down verbatim because he understood that it was exactly right, and that he could not have said it better himself. The decision to attach the birth records analysis to the land claim filing was Crane's, and it was a calculated risk. The land claim was a legitimate complaint with solid evidentiary footing. The eviction and seizure were documented. The contract terms were clear, and Reese had witnesses. Attaching the birth records analysis meant asking the circuit judge to expand the scope of his inquiry significantly beyond what the initial complaint required. It meant asking him to look at 31 years of administrative omission and decide that it merited a judicial response. Crane had no guarantee that Gideon Farr would do that. He had met Farr once at a county bar association gathering in the spring of 1871, and had found him to be a precise, economical man who chose his words carefully and did not seem to enjoy expansive conversation. He had no way of knowing what Farr thought about Reconstruction, about the Bureau, about the specific legal questions that the birth records gap raised. He submitted the table with the filing and waited. The Calvert family's response to the summons, when it came from the court in the late summer of 1872, told Crane something important. Edmund Calvert did not write a letter to the court. He did not respond through the county's local legal network. He traveled to Memphis and engaged the firm of Delacroix and Delacroix, father and son, who were known throughout the western Tennessee and northern Mississippi legal community as highly effective practitioners in property disputes, and whose fees were commensurately significant. The engagement of expensive out-of-county counsel for what was, on its face, a modest land dispute between a landlord and a tenant was itself a signal. Edmund Calvert understood that this was not a modest land dispute. He understood that the birth records table Crane had attached to the filing represented a different order of threat, and he was preparing accordingly. The preliminary filings from Delacroix and Delacroix arrived at Farr's court in early September, and they were comprehensive. They argued that the circuit court had no jurisdiction over the record-keeping practices of the county clerk's office, which was a state-level appointment operating under state law. They argued that the birth records question was irrelevant to the land dispute. They argued that Crane's table was the product of selective archival research designed to create an appearance of systematic omission where none existed. They argued that the proper remedy for any concern about birth records lay with the Tennessee state legislature, not a circuit court hearing. They asked that the birth records analysis be stricken from the record and that the hearing be limited strictly to the question of Augustus Reese's land claim. Farr's response was brief. He denied all three motions and confirmed the October 14th hearing date. What happened in the weeks between September and October on the Calvert property is known from two sources: Crane's journal, which he was keeping with increasing anxiety and precision, and a collection of letters that Edmund Calvert wrote to his brother in Memphis, which were preserved in the Calvert family papers and eventually donated to a university archive, where a historian working in the 1980s identified their significance. In his letters, Edmund describes the situation in terms that are by turns pragmatic and increasingly strained. He writes of the difficulty with the Bureau man, and of the Reese business, and of the unpleasantness with the records. He writes, in a letter dated September 28th, that he and Marsh have spoken to those who will be called to testify, and that several have come to see reason, and that the remaining difficulties are being addressed. The phrase, "come to see reason," in the context of tenant farmers in 1872 Tennessee, is carried a weight of implication that Edmund's letter did not need to make explicit. Crane's journal for September records the withdrawal of 3 witnesses from the group who had agreed to speak at the hearing. He records the departure of the Gentry family, Silas, Louisa, and their 4 children, from the property in the first week of October. He records his concern about Dorothea, who had not withdrawn and who was, he wrote, the most essential witness I have, because she alone can speak to events prior to 1865. and what she knows goes back to the beginning of the gap. He records that he visited her in late September and that she told him she would be at the courthouse on the 14th. He records that he believed her. He records that he was not sure that belief was sufficient. On the night of October 13th, the night before the hearing, Crane was in the county town, in the room he had rented at the hotel, when he heard from a rider that a fire had broken out on the far edge of the Calvert property. He rode out the next morning before going to the courthouse and saw the remains of the outbuilding. It had burned cleanly, leaving only a stone foundation and a pattern of ash. The building had contained stored goods belonging to Augustus Reese, the same grain and equipment that Edmund Calvert had seized in the original dispute. The county sheriff had already been there and had filed a report attributing the fire to accidental causes. Crane stood in the ash and looked at the pattern of it and wrote nothing for a long moment. Then he rode to the courthouse. Near the courthouse in the county town was a building that had seen better years. A two-story structure of red brick with a ground-floor courtroom that smelled of old wood and river damp, with windows that let in the thin October light in pale strips across the floor. By the time Gideon Farr called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock in the morning, the room was unusually full. Word had spread through the county, and through the freed people's community in particular, that something unusual was happening, that a circuit judge was going to ask about the records, and that the Calverts had brought lawyers from Memphis. Edmund Calvert sat at the respondents' table with the two Delacroix attorneys on either side of him. He was 43 years old by this point, a tall man going gray at the temples, dressed in the plain but well-made clothing of someone who had been prosperous and was maintaining the posture of prosperity through a period of diminishing circumstances. He did not look at the people seated in the gallery behind him. He looked at the judge and at the table in front of him, and at the ledgers that the county clerk had brought in a stack and set on a side table near the stenographer. Augustus Reese sat with Crane at the claimant's table. He was a man in his early 50s, compact and deliberate, with the quality of stillness that comes from having spent a lifetime making carefully considered decisions in situations where carelessness had consequences. He wore a dark coat that Crane had helped him obtain for the occasion, and he sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and he did not look at Edmund Calvert. Dorothea was in the gallery, in the second row, seated between two women from the former quarters who had come with her. She wore a dark dress and a white headscarf. She sat very straight. When Crane had seen her that morning, before the session began, she had looked at him with an expression he described in his journal as the look of someone who has been waiting for a long time and has finally arrived. He did not elaborate on what he meant by that. He did not need to. Farr opened the session with what he called preliminary matters. His voice was flat and precise, a voice that did not waste syllables. And he spoke about the hearing scope in terms that made the Delacroix attorneys visibly uncomfortable. He stated that in examining the filings in this case, that he had determined that the circuit court had both the authority and the responsibility to examine the county's record-keeping practices as they bore on the legal standing of residents within his jurisdiction. He stated that this was not a novel legal position. He cited two precedents, one from Eastern Tennessee and one from a Virginia circuit court, and that he did not intend to entertain further argument on the jurisdiction question. The older Delacroix rose to object. Farr told him to sit down. He then called Absalom Pettis, who had been the county clerk's deputy from 1845 to 1858, and who was now a man in his late 60s, white-haired and visibly unhappy to be in that chair. Pettis had been subpoenaed, which meant that unlike the witnesses who had been visited by Edmund Calvert and Marsh Calvert in September, and he had no option to withdraw. Farr asked him to describe, as precisely as he could recall, the office's practices for recording births during his tenure. Pettis spoke carefully, with the halting cadence of a man choosing each word before releasing it. He described the system, Household heads submitted birth information to the clerk's office, either in person or by written communication. The office did not conduct its own census of births. It recorded what was brought to it. This was, he emphasized, the standard practice across the county, not a practice specific to any particular type of property or any particular type of resident. Farr let that answer sit in the room for a moment. Then he said, "During your tenure, did the office ever receive a birth record submission from the Calvert family for any child born on their property?" Then Pettis said, "Not that I recall." Farr said, "Not that you recall, or no?" A long pause. The younger Delacroix was on his feet. Farr told him to sit down. Pettis said, "No, not during my tenure." Farr said, "Were there other properties in the county that similarly did not submit birth records during those years?" Pettis said, "Yes, several." Farr said, "Was the Calvert property notable among them for the length or consistency of the non-submission?" Another pause. Pettis looked at his hands. He said, "It was one of the larger operations. It had a larger number of persons for whom records might have been submitted." Farr said, "And none were?" Pettis said, "No." Farr thanked him and called his next witness. The session moved through the morning in increments that felt, to the people watching from the gallery, like a slow dismantling of something that had been held together for a very long time, with the adhesive of everyone's agreement not to look at it directly. Each witness, the current county clerk, 2 former magistrates, a man who had served as a surveyor for the county through the 1850s, added another layer to the picture that Farr was building. None of them was hostile. Most of them were simply men who had operated within a system and had never been asked, by anyone with the authority to ask, to describe exactly how that system worked. Under Farr's questioning, they described it, and what they described, collectively, was a system in which the documentation of births was an exercise of privilege available to those who had the social standing to exercise it. White families with property recorded births. The county clerk's office recorded what was brought to it. No one was sent to the quarters. No one was sent to any of the farm labor communities in the county. If the head of a household did not submit a birth record, the birth was not recorded. And if the head of a household was a man like Elias Calvert, a man who understood precisely what an absence of documentation made possible, then the non-submission of birth records was not an oversight, but a policy. The session broke for the midday recess, and when it reconvened in the early afternoon, Gideon Farr called Dorothea. She walked to the witness chair with the steadiness of someone who has decided, well in advance, that whatever happens next has already been accepted. She sat down across from the judge and looked at him directly, and she placed her hands in her lap, and she waited. Farr began by establishing, for the record, what he could establish: her name, her approximate age, her residence on the Calvert property, and the length of that residence. She answered each question clearly, without elaboration and without hesitation. She told him she had been born on that farm, as near as she could determine, in 1832. She had lived there her entire life. She was 40 years old, or near enough. He asked her whether she had children. She said, 7. He asked for their names. She gave them, all 7, in birth order, with the year she believed each had been born, and a brief description of each that served, in the absence of any documentary record, as a kind of testament. This one came 3 weeks early, and was no larger than a cat for the first month of her life. And this one had a birthmark the shape of a thumbprint behind his left ear. This one walked before 10 months. 7 children, each described in the specific, particular detail of a mother's memory, each named clearly for the court reporter to record. Because if they were being recorded now, for the first time, they would be recorded completely. Farr asked whether any of these births had been recorded with the county clerk's office. She said no. He asked whether she had attempted to have them recorded. She said, twice. Once in 1867 and once in 1869. She described both attempts. She had gone to the clerk's office, had given the children's names and birth years, had been told on the first occasion that the recording of births required submission by the head of household, and on the second occasion had been told by a man whose name she gave without hesitation, a deputy whose subsequent employment by the county could be verified, that the Calvert people don't do that. Farr wrote those words down on the pad before him. The Calvert people don't do that. The younger Delacroix rose to object to the characterization. Farr told him to sit down. He asked Dorothea, when the deputy said that the Calvert people don't do that, what did you understand him to mean? She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, I understood him to mean that the county office knew the Calverts had never submitted birth records, and that it was not the office's intention to change that practice. I understood that the policy came from the Calverts, and that the county office had agreed to follow it. Farr asked, and prior to your own attempts in 1867 and 1869, was this practice known to you? She said, it was something that had been known to people on that farm for as long as I can remember. It was understood that our births were not recorded. It was understood that this was deliberate. Farr said, how was it understood? She was quiet for a moment. Edmund Calvert was in the room. Marsh Calvert was in the room. She had not looked at either of them. She said, my mother tried to change it. In the winter of 1848. She walked to town and asked the county clerk whether her children were recorded. She was told they were not. She was sent away. There was no sound in the courtroom. Farr said, what happened after that? She said, within a year, my mother and her younger children were gone from the farm. They were sold or transferred or moved. I was never told, because I was not told anything. One day she was there, and one day she was not, and the county's records had never said she was there to begin with. So as far as the county was concerned, nothing had happened. Farr said, how old were you when your mother left? She said, 16. He let that sit in the room for a moment. Then he said, you said the county's records had never said she was there. What do you understand the practical consequence of that to be? She said, it means we can be moved without anyone noticing. It means when we're gone, there's no paper that says we were here. It means we can be disappeared, and the county won't even know to ask where we went. Because as far as the county is concerned, we were never anywhere. We had no names in any ledger. We had no dates in any book. We existed only in our own memory, and in the memory of the people around us, because no official hand had ever written us down. She paused. She said, my mother understood this. She walked 7 miles in February to try to change it. They sent her away, and then they moved her. Because she had shown she understood too much. That is what the absence of a record is for. It is not an oversight. It is a mechanism. And it is a mechanism that has been working on this farm and on this county for 30 years. The room was absolutely still. Edmund Calvert's face was without expression. He had spent 40 years learning his father's silence, and he held to it now, or appeared to hold to it. Marsh Calvert beside him had the look of a man who is watching something he cannot stop and is trying to decide whether this fact matters. The older Delacroix rose and asked, in a voice that had lost some of its earlier confidence, whether the witness had any direct evidence that the non-recording of births was a deliberate policy of his client's family rather than the general administrative practice of the county. Farr allowed the question. Dorothea turned and looked at the attorney. She said, "Every person on that farm knew it was deliberate. Every person in that county who had any dealings with the Calvert family knew it was deliberate. The county clerk who sent my mother away knew it was deliberate, because within 2 days of sending her away, Elias Calvert came to his office to express his satisfaction. I know this because after I was grown, I made it my business to know it. I asked, I read what I could find. I spoke to people who had been there. Although the deliberateness is not in doubt, it is simply that no one in a position of authority has ever before been willing to say so out loud in a room with a judge." She had not raised her voice. She had not been dramatic. She had stated these things the way a person states things that are simply, plainly true. Things that are so obvious to anyone paying attention that the only remarkable element is the number of years that went by without anyone in authority being required to acknowledge them. Farr looked at her for a long moment. Then he thanked her and called the session to a close for the day. That evening, Crane wrote in his journal, "She told the court what 30 years of records could not have told it as directly. She explained not just what was missing, but why it was missing, and what the missing was designed to accomplish. A record of absence is still a record. She had been keeping it in her memory for 40 years, and tonight, for the first time, it exists on paper in a form that the county cannot ignore." Gideon Farr reconvened the court the following morning and delivered his preliminary findings. He was measured and precise in the way he had been throughout the proceeding. There was no theatrical quality to his language, no oratory, no attempt to render what he had heard into more dramatic terms than the facts themselves provided. He stated his findings as findings, what he had determined on the basis of the testimony and documentary evidence before him to be true. He found, first, in the matter of Augustus Reese's land claim, that the eviction had been unlawful under the terms of the sharecropping contract as it had been written, and that the seizure of Reese's stored goods constituted a taking without legal basis. He ordered that the goods be returned, or that Reese be compensated at fair market value for what could not be returned. He set a schedule for the compliance and reserved the right to hold Edmund Calvert in contempt if the order was not fulfilled within 60 days. He found, second, in the matter of the birth records, that what the testimony and Crane's documentary analysis had established was a systemic and sustained practice of administrative omission that had deprived residents of the former Calvert property of official recognition of their legal existence for more than 3 decades. He stated that this practice had not been neutral in its effects, that it had been, as the testimony established, a deliberate mechanism whose function was to make certain people legally invisible in ways that served the economic and social interests of the property holder. He stated that the ending of slavery had not, in this county, been accompanied by the ending of this practice, and that free children, citizens under the 14th Amendment, were still being born without official acknowledgement of their existence. He could not undo what had been done. He was a circuit judge conducting a county hearing, not a federal tribunal with the power to reconstruct 3 decades of deliberately unmade records. He could not find Celia. He could not restore the names of everyone who had passed through that land without documentation. He could not give Dorothea the birth records she had tried twice to obtain. What he could do was create, going forward, a document. He issued an order directing the county clerk to conduct a census of all current residents on the former Calvert property, and, to the extent possible, on the other properties identified in Crane's analysis, and to enter into a supplementary register the name approximate age as best it could be established, familial relationships, and current residence of every person identified. He directed that this register be submitted to the State Comptroller's office in Nashville for permanent custody, beyond the reach of any future county official who might be inclined to misplace it. He directed that the supplementary register make explicit, beside each name, that no prior birth record existed in the county's books, so that the absence itself would be acknowledged and documented. He was making the record say, "We see you. We know you were not written down before. We are writing you down now." The supplementary register was completed in the spring of 1873. A county deputy spent 3 weeks on the former Calvert property and its surroundings, going cabin to cabin, taking down names and ages and family connections in a handwriting that has survived the century and a half since with reasonable clarity. The register records 41 people, 41 names, 41 lives, 41 brief biographies compressed into the administrative language of ages, relationships, current addresses. Among them are Dorothea's 7 children, named in the order she had given them in the courtroom, with the birth years she had supplied from memory, because there was no other source. Beside each name, birth not previously recorded. 4 words, a statement of fact that was also, in its quiet way, an indictment. Edmund Calvert contested Farr's land ruling through the Tennessee appellate courts for the next 4 years. He lost at every level. The courts, even in the political climate of the mid-1870s, as Reconstruction was winding down, and as the white political establishment of the former Confederate states was reasserting its control over regional institutions, could not find a legal basis for reversing Farr's specific and carefully reasoned findings. He sold the Calvert farm in 1877 and moved his family to Memphis, where he eventually took a position with a cotton brokerage firm and lived out the remainder of his life in the genteel diminishment of a man who had inherited a world and watched it become something he did not recognize. He died in 1894. His obituary in a Memphis newspaper described him as a former Tennessee agriculturalist and mentioned his service as a county commissioner in the 1860s. It did not mention the October 1872 hearing. It did not mention the supplementary register. It did not mention Dorothea or Augustus Reese or a woman named Celia who had walked 7 miles in February sleet to ask whether her children's births were written down anywhere. Marsh Calvert remained in the county for another decade, farming a smaller parcel of land under circumstances that were materially reduced from what the family had known before the war. He died in 1886. No detailed account of his life in those final years survives. Thomas Crane returned to Ohio in 1874 when the Freedmen's Bureau was formally dissolved by the federal government, a dissolution that was itself a kind of administrative act of forgetting, a deliberate withdrawal of the institutional framework that had been attempting, however imperfectly and under-resourced, to document and protect the legal standing of the freed people of the former Confederate states. Crane brought his journals and his table and all his notes back to Ohio with him. He worked for the rest of his life as a schoolteacher in a small town near Columbus. He married, had 3 children, and died in 1912. He had tried, on several occasions, to interest publishers in an account of his years in Tennessee, and had not succeeded. His journals were donated to a university library by his grandson in 1941 as part of a larger collection of family papers. They sat in the archive for more than 50 years, cataloged but unexamined, until a historian working on a study of Reconstruction-era record-keeping identified them in the 1990s and understood what they contained. The table that Crane had spent 3 months preparing in the summer of 1872. The table that documented 31 years of missing birth records across 4 properties in a western Tennessee county. is described by that historian as one of the most precisely documented examples of how administrative omission was used as a tool of control in the post-Civil War South. Augustus Reese received his compensation, the stored grain, or its equivalent in payment, and remained on the land he had been farming for the rest of his life. He died in 1901, at an estimated age of 80, on the same section of river bottomland that had been the site of the dispute that had brought Gideon Farr's circuit court to the county. His granddaughter was still living on that land decades later, and she gave an interview to a local newspaper in the 1940s in which she said, "My grandfather always told us that the most important thing that happened in this county was a man with a ledger book who noticed what wasn't in it, and a woman who knew all along and was finally asked to say it in a room where it had to be written down." Dorothea's story after the hearing is, like so much of the story before it, difficult to trace with precision. The supplementary register records her presence in 1873. A church membership list from a congregation in the county town includes her name in 1875. After that, the trail grows thin in the way that trails grow thin for people whose lives were not consistently documented, who remained, even after the hearing, even after the register, in a condition where the institutions of the county were not primarily oriented toward keeping track of them. What happened to her in the years after 1875, where she went, how she lived, when she died, if any record of these things was ever made, it has not been found. What was found, what Gideon Farr's one afternoon of testimony produced, was her name, and her children's names, and her words. Recorded in the court transcript, preserved in the State Archive in Nashville, where Farr's order directed it to be kept, available to anyone who looks. The forked Deer River still runs through western Tennessee. The bottomland along it is still farmed. The courthouse in the county town has been rebuilt twice since 1872. And the record-keeping practices of the county clerk's office are governed now by state and federal regulations that would have been unimaginable to Prewitt Holt. The birth records gap, the 31-year silence in the county's ledgers, is documented in Crane's table and in the supplementary register, and in the transcript of Gideon Farr's hearing, all of which sit in archives in Nashville and Columbus and at a Tennessee university, waiting for the researchers who know to look for them. The question that Dorothea asked in 1848, through her mother, who walked 7 miles in February to ask it, was, "Is there a record of my children?" And the answer was no. And the consequence of that no extended, in ways that can be traced through the county's documents, out across 24 more years and into the post-war period. Until a man with a table of missing records and a woman who had been keeping the memory alive in the absence of any official documentation together, found a judge who was willing to ask, "Why is no one's name written here?" That question, "Why is no one's name written here?" turns out to be one of the most important questions a society can ask itself. The answer tells you where the power is, and who is meant to be invisible, and what the people who run the records have decided about whose existence counts. It is a question that was asked in one county in western Tennessee in the autumn of 1872, and answered, partially, imperfectly, too late for Celia and for many others, by 41 names written down in a supplementary register, and each one accompanied by the quiet acknowledgement of an absence that had lasted far too long. Birth not previously recorded. The mechanism was not complicated. It never is. It was simply this: if the people in power choose not to write your name down, you do not exist in any document that the law will later consult. And if you do not exist in any document that the law will later consult, then the law cannot protect you, cannot find you, cannot, in the most fundamental sense, see you. Dorothea knew this her entire life. She had watched it happen to her mother, and she had spent 24 years understanding it. And when the moment came to say it plainly in a room where it would be written down, she said it. That is what this story's about. Not the fire in the outbuilding the night before the hearing, not the lawyers from Memphis, not even the judge. Though Farr's willingness to look at what no one else had wanted to look at was essential. It is about the 31 years of a silence that was maintained by the cooperation of many people, each of whom found the silence convenient, and the one woman who had been keeping the true record in her memory for all of that time, waiting for the room where it would finally count to say what she knew. This mystery shows us something that has not aged. The power to control a record is the power to control a reality. What do you think of this story?